Nice to meet all of you. So just coming back to the idea of defining sustainability and integrating or fostering a culture of sustainability within the workplace or your organization or institution, it's important to have a unified understanding of what sustainability is. So this is actually a definition that I like to use when talking about incorporating different imperatives. I'll just read it out. Sustainable development is a process of reconciliation of three imperatives. So the ecological imperative, to live within the global biophysical carrying capacity and to maintain biodiversity. The social imperative, to ensure the development of democratic systems of governance that can effectively propagate and sustain the values by which people wish to live. And the economic imperative, to ensure the basic needs are met worldwide. And within that, equitable access to these resources, ecological, social, and economic, is fundamental to its implementation. So just to...
251.
Yeah, exactly. 251. There we go. So when you guys, just stream of consciousness style, when you think about sustainability within your own workplace, what things come up, or what key issues come to mind right off the top of your head? Are there, like, paper consumption, or do you have anything just coming up right away that you're trying to tackle with, perhaps?
Closing the line.
Yeah, right.
It's really
yeah, for sure.
things to do.
Behavior changes.
Behavior,
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else?
Treating water or wastewater.
Yeah. Wastewater management. Yeah.
Well, the two sides of the operational footprint of the department, and then how you integrate these pillars into the decision-making process for our business.
Right.
For our external business.
Right.
Those are, not possible.
Yeah, exactly.
Along those lines, I'm thinking of the bureaucratic processes, integrating it into a vision statement and ongoing management to make those changes, and not necessarily imposed over them.
Right. And that's something that comes up a lot for us, which I'll talk about with sustainability assessment, is overall buy-in and having everybody involved in the process, or having at least a dialogue going on a whole engagement level, basically. So, and that is one key success factor for sustainability assessments or a broad-based sustainability strategy, because there's effective communication happening on all levels. Anything else? No. So for us, when we talk about sustainability, you can see here this diagram. We tend to think about it beyond the three pillars, which you hear a lot about, and thinking about it more as a sphere. So we have the sphere of the ecosystem, and within that, we have a sphere of society and a sphere of economy. So we're adopting a long-term perspective while meeting human needs now as well as human needs in the future, and redefining prosperity within participatory governance systems, and sharing natural resources equitably while protecting the global ecosystem. And I tend to talk about sustainability as an ongoing process. So it's not a static outcome or an end goal that you're trying to meet. It's something that's continually evolving and continually needs a conversation because of the state of our world. So within that, there's constant room for growth and constant room to improve your overall performance and your impact or your ecological footprint on the planet. So this is an interesting, well, you probably have seen this before, actually. It's the ecological footprint per person, per country, and this was mapped out in 2005. So you can see the green line here is the limit of the carrying capacity of the planet. So already in 2005, we were over the carrying capacity of Earth by 30%, and we've been over since the 80s. So we obviously really need to quickly change our footprint or our impact on the planet. And talking about sustainability, I thought this was interesting too. This is a poll that was done by the BBC in 2007, just a survey basically talking to people about how they see their overall well-being and happiness. And I found this interesting because if you look at the pie, 47% of the pie is carved out for partner, spouse, and family relationships, and 24% is health, whereas money and financial situation is only 7%, and a shelter or a comfortable home is only 8%. So I think that's important when we're thinking about maybe this is England, but I don't know. So assessments and our approach. So as I was discussing before, we do assessments for quite a large scope of different institutions, organizations, government. And essentially what we're doing is creating, as we've been talking about throughout the conference, is creating a portrait, a current portrait of our social, economic, and environmental performance or impact on the planet. So within that, thinking about measuring indicators or coming up with a framework, we can really choose a whole variety of indicators based on the idea of sustainability and social, economic, and environmental performance. So that's a pretty large task. And that pool of indicators can range from anything from water and energy consumption to looking at green building, waste production, overall engagement in the community, or participation in ethical investments or the local economy. And coming up with this pool of indicators for your assessment is something that we believe needs to be, well, first of all, coming back to buy-in, you need buy-in from your organization or institution, and there needs to be a level of participation to have an effective assessment. And there are a lot of benefits. So the first benefit, which is probably one of the most important, is you are creating a baseline that you can measure against in future years. And what that baseline is doing for you is helping you with strategy and action plans. So you can figure out where you are now and where you want to be. And within that, think of targets and how are you going to get there. So you're looking at your overall environmental and social impacts, but then you can come up with recommendations and next steps and fit that into a strategic plan or just a general strategy and action plan. So, and you're also creating a deeper accountability and transparency for the larger community, to inspire the larger community, but also for your stakeholders. And it's a way of developing a management system. And one thing we've seen a lot as well with sustainability assessments is people will come together to create a pool of indicators, but they might not have the management system developed to actually track that data. And this, I'm actually dealing with this right now with Algonquin College, who I'll talk about a little bit later, who I'm working with, where we've worked quite extensively with a large group, a sustainability committee, which involves the greater campus community, to come up with a pool of indicators. But half the data right now is like no data available in our report, because there is no management system, but it's important enough and people believe enough in this assessment, and it's just the beginning of their sustainability strategy, that they want the indicators in the assessment, and now are incorporating that within their strategy plan to create a management system and put that in place so they can begin to track the indicator. So I'll talk right now a bit more about our work with campuses. This is a quote from David Orr, who's come up quite a bit. And it's inspiring. I was just at the last workshop with John Robinson, as well as two others. And it's really interesting to see how the higher education sector is inspiring each other, and the movement is taking off in terms of sustainability planning. So our approach, working with campuses, is first of all thinking about a desired future state or a vision for the campus. And within that, there's a large public engagement component. So within that, we really make efforts to engage the entire campus community, which involves faculty, staff, students, which is really important, as well as administration and even people outside of the community, to start dialoguing and thinking about what sustainability means within their institution, and we like to start with a dreaming and scheming phase. So keeping it broad and open to not place any limitations on creative thought around what sustainability means and a culture of sustainability. And then from there we can work within a public engagement phase to think about a 5-year plan, a 20-year plan, and then take it to a 5-year plan and come up with strategy and action plan. And before we move to the strategy plan, we complete a baseline assessment if it hasn't been done before. And the World Cafe is a technique we use for public engagement, which is a pretty successful technique that's been used around the world to engage the public or stakeholders. So what we'll do is take a room like this with tables and basically try to create a cafe feel. And there'll be a facilitator and people at every table with a notepad and markers. And the facilitation will involve dreaming and scheming, essentially, about what you imagine your campus to look like in 5 years or 20 years, and what sustainability means. Like think about anything, whether it be carbon zero, net zero for all your buildings. Just keep it boundless in terms of ambition. And people will draw and have fun mapping out a future. And then we'll move from table to table, but there'll always be one core person at the table, so it helps to inspire collaborative thinking. So people will add to the map that's already there. And then for the assessment framework, there's a bunch of different frameworks that exist for colleges and universities. Well, there's Global Reporting Initiative that's used more for businesses but is being integrated into the college and university sector. And then there's CSAF, Campus Sustainability Assessment Framework, which is a framework that we developed that's been used around 30 or 40 different campuses now have used it. And then STARS, which is more based in the States right now, but is slowly being used in Canada as well. So this is CSAF, which is the framework we came up with. And it consists of 10 chapters. You can see them here. There's the ecosystem and the human system. And within each chapter, there's 33 subsections and a whole total of 171 indicators. So it's very extensive in terms of a framework, and can be a bit daunting for colleges or for smaller institutions because it's so extensive and requires so much data gathering. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a little bit. And innovation is key to sustainability strategies. And we can see now trends within the higher education sector where sustainability is taking off. For example, green cleaning programs are taking off all over. We see it at Royal Roads University, UBC, University of Alberta. LEED Platinum buildings that are being developed all over. For example, University of Portland has an amazing local food focus where they're connecting their campus to farmers markets throughout the university. So Concordia used this, we worked with Concordia on their sustainability plan, and they used our framework for their assessments. They've done 3 assessments now that has been super successful and has gotten international recognition. And a major success for Concordia is the general buy-in and the overall campus community involved in their entire sustainability strategy. So, for instance, with their assessments, they engage all the students. There was general excitement from the president to the students. So the president would issue letters to try to inspire and engage the greater campus community to be involved in the sustainability assessment. And then students were involved and getting credit for working on it. So for the actual assessment, you can't really see it, but the graphic layout, it's a huge document. It's about 300 pages. You can download it on their website if you're interested. But the students got credit to actually do the graphic design. That's just one example. And that helped enormously in terms of resources and just getting it done because it's such a massive undertaking. And since then, they have a whole sustainability department and over 12 staff now. And with Algonquin College, we're also using the Campus Sustainability Assessment Framework. we're just completing the baseline strategy right now, or the baseline assessment. But for Algonquin, because it's a smaller campus, using all 171 indicators it's too daunting for them. And also it just wasn't relevant. There was a whole bunch of indicators in CSAF that they couldn't really measure, and they didn't choose, it just didn't really fit in. So we went through a whole series of long meetings with a sustainability committee to come up with 40 indicators from CSAF and a few that were modified from STARS. This is a photo of the World Cafe, dreaming and scheming the desired future state. And with Algonquin College, we're trying hard to engage the whole greater community by also involving newspapers, and like the Algonquin Times newspaper and radio, as well as survey instruments to keep an ongoing dialogue, and using website and blogs to get students to talk and envision their campus and what it could look like in 20 years. And moving on to our work with governments, we just developed a greenhouse gas modeling tool. And this tool is currently being piloted by the Fraser Valley Regional District in BC. And basically what this tool is an evaluation of impacts of land use decisions on greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a quantitative tool assessing the impact of land use decisions on greenhouse gas emissions. And what it essentially is a calculator, and we plug in a bunch of different data into the calculator, including infrastructure and land use patterns, so looking at density, mix of land uses, energy supply of infrastructure, and transportation networks, as well as looking at transportation modes in buildings, building site and design, to energy use, transit vehicles, motors, appliances, HVAC systems. And essentially what this tool is doing is it's quantitative support, showing that it's basically support for smart growth, support for dense, compact communities. So we also helped Salt Spring Island in BC with a study looking at greenhouse gas emissions and land use. And what we saw, one of the results of the study was that dense, compact communities is directly correlated to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Also, we see that shifting away from the automobile is very important. Reduced risk profile for extreme weather events, and reduced absolute dependence on fossil fuel.
So Rebecca's talked about sustainability assessments on campuses, a little bit with businesses. I wanted to talk a little bit about our sustainability assessments with nonprofit organizations. And I think there are things that you'll see in this that hopefully can be applicable to whatever context you're in. I thought it was kind of interesting, Darren, that in this conference I was expecting more nonprofit organizations to be represented here, but there really aren't a lot, which is sort of interesting because I mean, obviously nonprofit charitable organizations are by mandate, their mandate is to affect change in the world. A lot of them have a kind of sustainability mandate, whether you're an international development organization working on global issues, whether you're an environmental NGO working on environmental issues in Canada and so forth. It is a really big sector in Canada, and it's one that we often overlook. I'm sure that I thought there might be some people representing nonprofits in the room, but if you don't actually work for a nonprofit, you're probably either volunteer with one, or you're on the board of one, or you donate to one, or you're involved in some way with a nonprofit organization. It's actually a sector that unfortunately is behind business when it comes to sustainability, which is a bit ironic given the mandates of nonprofits. But what I found is that, and as you heard Johanna speaking this morning about some of the things that are happening in business, I do find it a bit ironic that the nonprofit sector is behind business. There are 161,000 nonprofits in Canada. It's the second largest nonprofit sector in the world, behind the United States. And 11% of all Canadians work for some kind of nonprofit, responsible for about $79 billion in GDP, about 8% of our economy, which is, by the way, bigger than either the automotive sector or the manufacturing sector in Canada. So we decided that we really wanted to work with nonprofits, and because it's not a small sector, and because we also feel that nonprofits have a real potential to reach out to other sectors in Canada. A lot of them have large volunteer bases, a lot of them have large donor bases, and so we really felt that nonprofits should be leading by example when it came to sustainability. Interestingly, when we've gone to this sector, there's been a lot of, I wouldn't say resistance to sustainability assessments, but it's been difficult to get the uptake, actually. And we've been trying to think about why that's the case. A lot of them, of course, are smaller organizations. So, I mentioned there's 161,000 of these in Canada, but a lot of them are probably 5 to 10 people. And so I think a lot of them are saying, we're a real small office. We're just a drop in the bucket. What kind of difference can we really make? And so that may be one reason. A lot of them, I think, feel, look, we're here to do good in the world. We got to concentrate on the programs that we're delivering. Why should we look internally at our own systems? And so that may be another reason for it. Maybe donors aren't demanding it. In the business sector, often the demand is driven by consumers, by clients. Nonprofits don't have customers; they have donors, so they may not be demanding it. If you're a donor to an organization, it's one thing you may want to think about in terms of where your money is going and how that organization is fostering sustainability. And I think, quite frankly, a lot of them just can't afford it. Sustainability is not cheap. It does require an investment, and a lot of nonprofits, especially in this economic climate, are really feeling squeezed in terms of their budgets. A lot of them are laying off staff, and so if it's a choice of keeping your program coordinator for a certain program versus doing a sustainability assessment, an area that they're not familiar with, they may not choose that. So we're trying to change that, and one of the areas of sustainability that we're working on is to really get nonprofits to think about their carbon emissions. And it's true, it's not the oil patch. It's not necessarily an industry that you would think of as, or a sector that you would think of as having a large impact on carbon emissions. But in fact, the particular nonprofit that I'm going to talk about in terms of the case study was quite shocked to discover that when we did the baseline assessment, their emissions were over 10 tons per capita, which is more than the entire per capita in Great Britain, for example. In Canada, I think we heard yesterday, we're now at around 22, 23 tons per capita. So that's for the entire country of Canada. And so in this office, what they found in their baseline assessment was that just in the office operations of that organization, their emissions were over 10 tons per capita. And it's not an atypical organization. in that way. So, so the case study that that I want to tell you about was a nonprofit with about 25 staff. Had a mandate to basically work on social justice issues, including the issue of climate change and energy use in Canada, looking at the impact of fossil fuels and so forth. And so they thought, okay, if this is part of a program, and we're urging, they had an education program, an outreach program, an advocacy program with the federal government. They thought if we're espousing these things, we better turn the spotlight inward and look at our own office in terms of how are we doing in terms of our use of fossil fuels, our use of energy, and ultimately our carbon emissions. And obviously, you know, wanting to, as the session is entitled, walk the talk. Of course, the first thing we did was to identify the areas of office, various facets of the office that they wanted to measure, and so here's just some examples of some of the things we looked at: transportation, employee, air and ground travel, for example, employee commuting. Looked at those things. In terms of the building, looking at electricity use, heating and cooling, water heating, that sort of thing. And this is a bit of a tricky area for a lot of nonprofits because they don't own the buildings. A lot of them don't own the buildings that they're working in. And so when you're looking at, for example, you know, measuring electricity or measuring your water use and that sort of thing, you have to go and work with the landlord as well. And that was sometimes a bit of an impediment. And also procurement, office supplies, paper use, equipment purchase, that sort of thing. Since we did this particular assessment with this nonprofit organization, we've hooked up with a software developer called Carbon Connect. You can look them up on the internet if you like. What they do is they provide software that makes it much easier to capture the various operations in an organization, to capture the energy use that's associated with any particular kind of activity. I mean, you know, we often think there's some easy categories that you can measure. You know, how many people flew to get to this conference, for example? Nobody flew? Great. But, you know, so obviously there's been a lot of talk about, you know, you can offset your flight, and it's fairly easy to measure the impact of traveling from Winnipeg to Toronto, for example. There are, you know, all sorts of carbon calculators online where you can measure the carbon emissions. But it's a little harder to think about some other facets of your operations. And so, you know, for example, let's look at putting on a conference, which lots of us do as part of our operations. We're here at a conference, so you order 150 lunches for people. What's the impact of what's the carbon emission impact of 150 lunches? We're renting some rooms. We're generating conference packages. You know, what's the impact of that? You bought a bunch of office supplies from Grand and Toy. What's the carbon impact of that? So there are now a lot of really good tools out there for measuring not only the really obvious things, but the things that aren't so obvious. And so we've been hooking up with some of those latest tools that really make it easier to capture and measure some of these things. I mean, I personally foresee a time when, you know, I mean, we talk about, again, Johanna talked this morning about how in Europe auditors are auditing not only financial things but non-financial things, and that this is becoming standard, so that companies are producing reports that are audit reports, but they're not just about financials. They're about the other aspects of a company's operations, the non-financial aspects. And what I would like to see develop at some point in the future is actually accounting software that has built into it tools that measure the impact of your purchasing decisions and of your purchases. So we use QuickBooks or whatever accounting package we have for our particular offices, and they're able to track our financial transactions very well. And I think what's probably going to be coming in the future is that kind of accounting package that automatically correlates a purchasing decision with the impact that that purchasing decision had on the organization. And so we're not there yet, but I think it's probably something that is coming in the not too distant future. So what were some of the, of course we've talked about the importance of baseline assessments. Alice in Wonderland said, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. I don't know if you can say the reverse. If you don't know where you started, if you don't know where you started from, any road may get you back there. In other words, if you don't establish a baseline, you have no reference point. And some of the challenges that we had in establishing an accurate baseline for this particular organization, first of all, choosing the baseline period. In this particular situation, we had a client who was feeling pressure from their constituency to get this carbon emission study done and to start showing results in their organization. And so we actually started working with them at the end of their fiscal year. What we did is, in order to establish a baseline year, we worked backwards within that fiscal year, which turned out to be a mistake actually, because there weren't proper systems in place to collect the kind of data that we needed for establishing the baseline. And so we resorted to some methods that tried to interpret some of the data that was there, that tried to extrapolate it from surveys and other methods, which in the end didn't actually produce a really accurate baseline. What we should have done is we should have said to the organization, let's forget about the current year that you're in. Let's establish the following year as the baseline period. That way you can set up the systems for data collection that you need, and really, I mean, if you don't have an accurate baseline, it really diminishes the trust of the organization in terms of collecting future data for comparison purposes. So the lesson there is, when you're choosing your baseline period, make sure it's a period where you can put in place the kind of data collection systems that you need in order to measure what it is that you ought to measure in the future against the baseline. So that was an important lesson for us. It's also, in terms of the scope, you can spend a lot of time measuring things that really aren't essential to the organization. And so, it's important to really choose at the beginning the 5 or 6 or however many things it is that in this case are going to be the major sources of carbon emissions. And so, there's no point. For example, one of the things that they wanted to measure was their waste as an organization. Well, it turns out that the waste actually accounted for a tiny, tiny fraction of their carbon emissions. So, one of their employees did an audit of their waste, took the garbage cans, spread it out on the floor, analyzed it, weighed it, all that sort of stuff. And it was an interesting exercise, but in the end, a lot of time was spent on that, and it accounted for less than 1% of the carbon emissions. So it's important to really establish a proper scope. I've already talked about the importance of accuracy in terms of the baseline. Variables are another thing to consider. In this case, what happened was the organization, shortly after we did the baseline study, laid off about 15% of its staff. And so rather than having a total emissions baseline data, we should have really portrayed it back to the client as per capita. So, you know, if you have a total emissions of 200 tons, for example, in a year, and you lay off 10% of your staff, bingo, you've met your target because you've reduced your emissions by 10%. And of course, that isn't really a realistic portrayal of an organization actually having reduced what it set out to do. And so you have to really think about what are the variables that can enter into the collection of the data, and that will affect both the baseline and the subsequent reports that you measure against the baseline. Another problem that we came across was that there wasn't the necessary buy-in at the senior management level. Rebecca touched on that a little bit in terms of the importance of ownership. And so within this organization, there was one particular staff person who was the ecological program coordinator for the organization. And of course, she was really gung-ho on this process and inspired a lot of her colleagues in terms of, you know, we really want to measure our carbon emissions, and here's some ways that we're going to reduce them, and this organization can become a model for other NGOs and so forth. And what happened was there was a lot of initial enthusiasm for the project, and when it actually came time to devote financial resources to the reduction plans, they weren't that forthcoming, and it's because the senior management and board hadn't really bought into the process. They were aware of it, but they didn't really realize that what was happening here was a real change in organizational culture, that it wasn't just a little bit of tinkering around the edges of the organization, that this was really about transforming the culture of the organization. And that's a big thing to do, and you need to have senior management and the board on board when you're doing that sort of a thing. And so sustainability really requires organizational transformation, and that has to involve everybody, and it has to involve the key decision makers. So that's really important. Some of the other challenges in terms of walking the talk, as I said earlier, sustainability is not free. Now, there are payoffs, obviously, that come with implementing sustainable plans. And yeah, if you're in the session with UBC before lunch, John Robinson talked about this incredible building that's being built on UBC campus, and what they found was that the actual capital cost for that building was comparable to a conventional building. But there are, in some cases, instances where you have to put up some initial investment. And I think business is better at thinking about this than nonprofit organizations in terms of, okay, you're going to make an investment, you're going to get a payoff in terms of, 4 or 5 years down the road. And so we've really had some challenges in terms of trying to convince nonprofit organizations that it's, you need to make an initial investment, and it's perhaps going to affect your bottom line in that particular year, but you're going to get payback, 2 or 3 or 4 years down the road. Feedback tools are really essential when you're doing sustainability assessments and the implementation of them. you know how when people used to do these fundraising campaigns, they'd have like this big thermometer, and it would show you different levels that you're reaching as you're doing your fundraising. That sort of thing is really important when you're working with an organization in terms of as they start to make progress towards their targets, they do need very visual feedback tools. Otherwise, it can get kind of discouraging and intangible as well. It's really interesting here in Toronto now. We've gone to time of use for our electricity consumption, and so you can go onto a website and type in your account number, and you can see exactly how much electricity you used in the previous day. And it's a really cool feedback tool to so you can see, oh yeah, that's when I ran the washing machine, or that's when the house was full of people, and you can actually see graphically how much electricity you used each hour for the previous day. So those kinds of visual feedback tools are really important. Compliance tools, obviously. So just as an example, in this organization, they decided that any travel less than 500 kilometers in Canada was going to be by train. And then what they found was that people were making all sorts of excuses for doing short hop plane fares because they had to get back to the office, they didn't have time to take the train, etc. And so you really have to put in place compliance tools in order to ensure that what the organization has committed to in its policies is going to be implemented. And keeping it simple. Another example here is, so we wanted, in this particular organization, travel actually made up 80% of their carbon emissions. A lot of international air travel, a lot of ground travel. And so what we did is we put in place some spreadsheets for each employee to track their particular travel. So for, if you took a taxi, if you took a bus, if you took a train, if you drove your car somewhere, if you took a flight, and it became really burdensome after a while. So there was supposed to be a centralized Excel spreadsheet that people were to feed in their travel, and they couldn't get sign-off on their reimbursement or for their check unless they actually entered it into that spreadsheet. So when they were getting a check requisition or something, there's a little box that they had to fill out in order to be able to process that particular payment. That itself wasn't a bad tool, but the spreadsheet actually really bogged people down. And so our lesson there was that you need simple tools in order to be able to track the ongoing data, because that was one that definitely didn't work for people. It just was too time-consuming, too complicated. Not every staff is comfortable working with a spreadsheet, etc. So that was another lesson learned. Just the last thing here in terms of this particular case study. Based on our experience in working with nonprofits for the last year, we started a new program called Carbon Account, and it basically tries to systematize some of our experience into a new program that is basically a carbon auditing and reduction program for nonprofit organizations. And if you're interested in this, you can go to our website. We're always looking for new organizations to work with, and we feel that this is a program that eventually will hopefully become standard operating procedure for nonprofits, that just as they produce an audited report, they will also produce an audited report for their carbon emissions. It's going to take some time. We're just at the beginning of it. But we hope to be the pioneers in this field. So anyways, that's the case study around that particular example. And I hope there are some things that you could pick up in there for maybe your own organizations. So I'll turn it back over to Rebecca, and then we're going to get into some table exercises soon.
can you guys hear me? Oh, there we go. I'll just quickly talk about SSG in our own personal assessment. So we're, like I mentioned before, we're a workers co-op, a national-based workers co-op, and we essentially help clients bring sustainability into their own work.
Rebecca, back up a bit. You're covering up the...
Thanks. So we do, as well as sustainability assessments, we also do a lot of work with green building. So to give you an example, we just finished working on the Vancouver Convention Centre just before the Olympics were launched, which was certified as LEED Platinum, which we were very excited about. And we also work with municipalities doing integrated community sustainability plans and climate change mitigation. So for our own assessment, we post these up on it. We do it on an annual basis, and we post these up on our websites. So if you guys are interested in checking it out, you can go to our website. And how we've structured our assessment is there's 4 different subsections. So the first one is toward cooperation, collaboration, and community. And one of our mandates is to give 10% of our profits to grassroots organizations on a quarterly basis. So how we'll do that is every quarter one of our members will come up with a theme. So it could be anything. And within that theme, we'll all together come up with 3 or 4 different grassroots organizations to donate 10% of our profits to. That's what we strive to do every year, and we'll report back in our assessment to illustrate if we've succeeded or not. And then our second chapter is toward healthy workplace, healthy lives. So one example is total average absenteeism rate. And then we have toward diversity, equity, and justice. And we have an online survey that we use to measure this different indicator, which is % of worker members self-identifying as a minority. And then the 4th chapter is toward ecological sustainability. So one example is we do a greenhouse gas inventory of our own co-op. So all of our workers measure their own greenhouse gas emissions for work, but also personally. And we track all of that within our own assessment. So and it's interesting, it's actually become part of our culture. We've developed a management system around this. So whenever a worker member travels, we have a calculator that we've also developed to establish the greenhouse gas emissions per distance. So we track if you're using a hybrid vehicle versus a SUV, or if you're taking the bus or train or plane, long flight, short flight, and we have a whole calculator establishing how many greenhouse gas emissions are emitted per mode. Just to wrap up, thinking about walking the talk. Before we do this, I just wanted to bring up also Count, Cut, Compel as a marketing strategy we developed with a design firm, which was, if you guys want to check this out as well, this is the website, countcutcompel.com, and it's basically inspired by reduce, reuse, recycle. And we've come up with a logo and this marketing strategy basically to inspire and educate people around climate change. So we've partnered with the Rocky Mountain Institute in America, as well as a whole bunch of other organizations to start using this. It's a free marketing strategy like reduce, reuse, recycle to help inspire and motivate people to count their GHGs, cut and compel others to do the same.